Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for our inaugural gathering of Research Bites. My name is Tracy Matthews. I'm the Executive Director at the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture. Research Bites is one of several programs that we'll be rolling out to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the center. I'd like to give a shout out to our program administrator, Tiara Kilpatrick, for conceiving of the series. And I want to say congrats to those of you who are enjoying a lunch bite on us from Grubhub. And we hope to be able to meet in real life for Research Bites over lunch sometime in the future. Our goal for the series is to connect staff from across the university with faculty affiliates of the center who study, teach, and write about race and ethnicity. Some of us work closely with faculty regularly, but many of us do not. So we wanted to create an informal space for staff members to learn firsthand about some of the exciting research happening on campus and to provide an opportunity for networking between faculty and staff, with the hope that we will find some shared interests and possibilities for future collaborations. So kicking off the series, our first speaker is C. Riley Snorton, who is the interim faculty director of the Race Center and a professor of English language and literature and jointly appointed with the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality. Riley is a cultural theorist who focuses on racial, sexual, and transgender histories and cultural productions. He's the author of Nobody is Supposed to Know, Black Sexuality on the Down Low and Black on Both Sides, A Racial History of Trans Identity. And he's the co-editor of Saturation, Race, Art, and the Circulation of Value. He's also the co-editor of GLQ, a journal of gay and lesbian studies. Riley received his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania Annenberg School for Communication with graduate certificates in Africana Studies and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. So thank you, Riley, for volunteering to go first. I think, do we want to still try to do a round? No.
I really wish we could. I'm so honored. First of all, thank you so much, Tracy, for the introduction. Thank you so much to the staff at CSRPC, Marilyn Willis, Jacqueline Gaines, Tiara Kilpatrick, Beth Awano, who I believe will be jumping on in a bit. And I want to especially thank Tiara for developing this idea. It's really an honor to get to be first. And this is one of the moments where I wish we were in person more than ever. I prepared a few slides. This is meant to be also conversational, informal, so I'll talk briefly through the slides, which have to do with work that I've published, but also some of the new work. And then I'm hoping that we can have a kind of open-ended conversation, either around some of these projects or around the fields in which they are in conversation. So just allow me a second to pull up my slides. One second. Of course, I tested this in our pre-conversation, and now I am seeing that it's not giving me the same options. Here we go. I'm just vamping. So, in fact, I was planning on doing a little bit of this introductory work. So I wanted to start with just a conversation. Can everyone see the slides? Perfect. So I wanted to start actually by talking a little bit about intellectual biography. And so I received my BA actually in Women and Gender Studies with a concentration in African Studies from Columbia. And I received an MA and PhD in the areas of communication and culture, otherwise known as media studies, from the University of Pennsylvania. And before starting at University of Chicago, this is my 4th year here, I started as an assistant professor of rhetoric and public culture at Northwestern, and then was assistant and then associate professor of Africana Studies and Gender and Sexuality Studies at Cornell. So My work is in conversation with, is situated within several fields. Black feminism, Black trans studies, Black studies, queer studies. And I have as the kind of final 3 points on the slide, what I think of as kind of the big overarching questions that guide any and all of my projects. The first being, what are the relationships between Blackness, gender, and sexuality? How have these relationships changed over time? And how do we interpret the interplay of these identifications? And, in addition to how that kind of manifests in Black on both sides and nobody's supposed to know, it's also been something that's animated some of my collaborative projects, obviously GLQ, the journal, but also in some of my, some work in special issues. For example, collaborating with Scott Polson Bryant, who is the founding editor of Vibe magazine. We did an issue on the queerness of hip hop, the hip hop of queerness, which is absolutely about kind of thinking through popular culture and representations of Black sexuality. The second question, I would say, is at the heart of the first question. Why am I interested in the relationships between Blackness, gender, and sexuality? I think that they open up onto questions about freedom. And for me, I think of the work as an opportunity to ground what we understand to be freedom. Certainly, freedom is taken up as a kind of philosophical, political ideal, but I'm also interested in it at the level of practice, and particularly, what does it mean to experience freedom? So if freedom is something that's ephemeral, is something that we can experience briefly, what are the conditions for that kind of experience? Is a kind of big question that I think my work is attempting to address. Finally, what kinds of vocabulary enable thinking and talking about and across multiple forms of difference? And certainly, I think those questions are deeply a part of how we think about Black feminist studies, from the kind of key text and key terms like intersectionality. And for me, that work is also always in relation to questions of sexuality and gender identity. I'll continue on, but I also see that there are a number of comments in the chat. So I'm looking forward to engaging that. And I will ask folks from CSRPC if there are questions that are particularly germane that I should pivot to before moving on, to just please flag that for me, because I'm looking at the slides, I'm unable to engage in the text. So just briefly about the first book, and I've given some illustrations here on the side. I began this project as a dissertation in the early to mid 2000s. And it was at the time that R. Kelly's Trapped in the Closet was being released over time. And I was deeply interested in his now concluded legal response, the form of justice that has attended his sexual abuse. But I was thinking a lot about how he was managing his reputation alongside the wildness of the series. I'm not sure if anybody remembers Trapped in the Closet, but it was about all kinds of secret forms of sexuality, including an instance of the down low. And the down low is a term that typically refers to Black men who have sex with men and women and do not identify as gay or bisexual. And certainly folks who were taking in media at the turn of the 21st century, we're seeing that in a whole host of places, from Oprah Winfrey's kind of iconic expose to, as you'll see, this book that I've put on the slide, On the Down Low by J.L. King. J.L. King in many ways was a kind of, I will call him a pioneer in down low capitalism, where there were a number of folks who were writing books that were often pitched as self-help, that read a little bit like memoir, but also kind of like a whodunit detective story. And I was really interested in how the down low allowed for and rationalized certain forms of surveillance. What did it mischaracterize about the kind of understandings of transmission of HIV/AIDS? Namely, that while it was brought to bear and very popular in the early 2000s to describe the increased rates of HIV and AIDS among Black women, it also masked a story about the CDC and other reporting agencies who had been, in many ways, structurally repressing those cases and those instances beforehand, right? So for folks in and related to public health, there were already a set of assumptions about who would have HIV and AIDS that dictated how they thought about reporting and who they were, and who was being solicited or encouraged to get tested. Those metrics changed in the early 2000s. And so for me, the down low figure was a kind of intensification of an already established set of protocols for encountering Black sexuality through surveillance, and a concept that I wanted to work through as a way of thinking about those dynamics was the glass closet, which I think about it in a very material way, like thinking about a kind of glass, an all encased set of four walls, where one side we might think of as being hypervisibility, another side is kind of structured by confinement, spectacle in one sense, and speculation on the other. And so I talked both about the down low, but also about other forms of mediated and popular culture. And I was particularly interested too in why it was that so many popular artists were rumored to be gay or trans. What did that also tell us about these kinds of stories, where we could think about Black sexuality more generally beyond the kind of scope of the individual down low figure, who in some ways is a trickster figure. He's everywhere, he's nowhere. And so that was the kind of crucible of the first project. I put Ma Rainey also to show that there was a kind of historiographical piece. And I was interested in thinking about a genre of blues called down low blues that was explicitly sexual, Ma Rainey being a kind of key figure in that. And that one of the things that I was arguing is that kind of blues also tells us a story about the Great Migration and about what kinds of surveillance is made possible by living in more densely packed cities as people move north. So this was a kind of long arc of an argument. The next project is Black on Both Sides. And in many ways, I came to this project because people kept asking me who works on race and trans studies, which I'm sure probably occurs for folks as like a very bizarre thing that people would ask. But trans studies is seen as a relatively recent field. And there were many colleagues of mine who were developing their trans syllabi and would just ask me, like, is there an article about this? And it was initially I thought, oh, this project is going to be about, some of the articles that I had been working on and maybe a collection of essays. But it quickly began to be a kind of full project. And it's told in three parts. So the first part is called Blackened, and it's really about two sets of narratives that take place in the 19th century. On one hand, I'm looking at the brutal experiments on enslaved Black women that constitute the beginnings of or are seen as the material and constituting narrative for the founding of American gynecology by J. Marion Sims. And I'm thinking particularly with some work in Black feminism, notably Hortense Spillers, who argues around, or who offers up the kind of concept of flesh as a way for thinking about several phenomena that surrounds enslaved Blackness and how it has been, how it was rendered during slavery. So in one sense, flesh as another unit for thinking about something like personhood, so flesh as opposed to body, flesh as a way of kind of thinking about how enslaved Black people were or seen to be offered up or able to be experimented on. So obviously the kind of case of Sims is a long grounding practice in exploring that idea. But also thinking about, for Spillers, she suggests that because, Blackness is rendered as flesh, something like the distinction between man and woman is lost in the outcome. And by that, we can think about the kind of practices of plantation labor. Often we can think about it in terms of labor practices. We can also think about it in terms of fungibility, right? So the kind of sense of interchangeability as when people are rendered as resource. And so the first chapter is really thinking about how Sims manages to have a whole legacy in these very logics. The second chapter is kind of thinking about this notion of fungibility as it relates to fugitivity, as it relates to the number of enslaved folks who were able to escape across the Mason-Dixon line, and the frequency with which those folks cross-dressed, but for me, I think of it as kind of presenting themselves in a different gender in order to do so. So in thinking not about those, that thinking about them not in terms of drag or cross-dressing, but as presentation of a different gender, both of those chapters are really aimed at offering up something like the kind of racial logic of gender transformation, right? That like we've seen how in terms of thinking about fungibility or the malleability, the interchangeability of folks within slavery also gives us a rubric for thinking about what does it mean for the body to be able to change, to become malleable. And that's the kind of opening section. I'll also note that, trans studies is relatively recent. I would kind of anchor it to Susan Stryker's work in the 90s, so pretty recent, right? Trans people are also erroneously understood to be recent as well. And so it was really helpful for me to go to the 19th century, where I also found like figures who I think if the vocabulary was present might somehow relate to being trans. That's particularly told in the story of the two Marys. Mary Jones, who was a sex worker in New York, who talks about, how she feels comfortable appearing as a woman in public, and how when she's in New Orleans, she's always that way and people celebrate her as such. That testimony coming in court because they pressed charges against her, in part for her presentation, in part because she was doing some illicit activity with some of her Johns. The second part of the book is about it's called Blackout. So it really takes off where the kind of official trans narrative begins. So there's an understanding that, and I contest this idea, but there's an understanding that trans identity begins with the kind of gender clinic in the 1950s. And that story is often crystallized through a figure like Christine Jorgensen, who is in some ways considered the kind of first transsexual celebrity, who was a former GI, who became in many ways a movie star before her kind of decline in public opinion. And the images on this slide are figures who were contemporaneous with her, Carlette Brown and Jim McHarris, whose stories appeared in Ebony and Jet at the same time, and who talk a little bit about the kind of difficulties for these particular Black working class folks to be able to access something like a gender clinic to confirm and affirm their gender. And so I talk about, what are the kind of other politics, world politics infused by race that are happening at the same time that would allow for something like a big, international story about transformation and bodily transformation alongside a kind of a set of recalcitrant struggles around Jim Crow, around, a host of forms of neo-colonial and decolonial struggles. And so I set up the kind of story of trans studies within a kind of global racial political context. In the final part, I am thinking about a story that brings us a kind of more contemporary trans figure, Brandon Teena, made popular by Boys Don't Cry, or at least became much more generally known through the film Boys Don't Cry, and about the omission of another person who was killed by the murderers, Philip Devine, a disabled Black man who, in fact, initially when police came to the scene, their first thought was that he was the attacker rather than the victim. And the interest in telling his story was one about, what would it mean to kind of restore him to that historical record. But by centering him in that story, it also allows for a kind of meditation on what's the relationship between something like anti-Black racism and transphobia. How do those things interanimate one another, amplify each other, intensify one another? And in many ways, I was drawn to think about that relationship in terms of a kind of concept like still life. Still life as a way of thinking about what it means to work historically with narratives that are not as well known, but that it is still about honoring the living, even if we come to understand posthumously. Still life as a way of marking the conditions that are very difficult for many Black trans people to survive. And so Black on Both Sides is obviously, well, perhaps obvious to some, a deeply personal project. I thought of it as, when I was writing, I put the kind of big stakes on it, like this was my life's work. And it still has this kind of world that I feel so honored and proud of, that lives in and among Black trans movement spaces. Since being at UChicago, I have co-edited an anthology, Saturation, Art, Race, and the Circulation of Value, with my collaborator and friend, Hintai Yap. This project was with both MIT Press and with the New Museum. And, in many ways, I think of getting started on projects because I'm pulled by two things. I'm confused about something and I'm upset about something. And for me, I was, for my colleague and I, Hintai and I, we were upset about what we saw as a kind of cycle, an unending cycle of how people discussed controversies in the art world, that there would be something that was contested, and I would add here, like, rightfully so, for often rightfully so, for its kind of content. The media would kind of represent it as, oh, this artist is being attacked by these activists. Then there would be a question posed potentially, like, well, whose responsibility is it? Is it the artist? Are the activists being too sensitive? What's the role of the museum? And then that would be where it would end. And then we would get another cycle based on another piece of content. And so we're interested in thinking about how do we disrupt this, right? Like what's alongside and perhaps the thing that actually generates something like racial representation in art. And we took an explicitly Marxist perspective on thinking about these questions. Where does representation matter, right? And some of that meant explicitly engaging with the very few folks of color working on the National Museum curatorial stage and kind of talking to them about the context of their labor and their work. It was about talking to art historians and performance studies folks and scholars of race and forms of difference more generally to kind of think through how these recurring stories of controversy might also help us to think about the ways that the art world are deeply embedded in racial capitalism. And so that project is both kind of a set of essays and conversations, but also includes a number of artists who have contributed their work as what we call portfolios, from Kara Walker to Ralph Lemon to Lorraine O'Grady, who's represented on the slide, Candace Lynn. And so that was a project that was also a kind of first foray for me into thinking specifically about some of the same questions in the earlier slide, but in the register of art more specifically. Finally, I just want to kind of leave with quick sentences about some of the new work that I'm working on, and then hopefully I can engage the chat and we can engage each other. So currently I'm working on an edited anthology with my colleague Margot Crawford on Hortense Spillers, who I mentioned earlier, who's also represented on the slide. And it is organized in two ways. One, around conversation. So one of the concepts that I feel like I'm obsessed with in her work is this idea of an intramural protocol. And by which I think, and I always say, I think she means like a series of conversations that bring folks with political commitments into rigorous questions and answers. And I'll pause there, but maybe we'll talk a little bit more about intramural protocol. And so in this way, we want to explicitly highlight the fact that she has been in dialogue and conversant across many fields as a way of marking her impact across multiple disciplines. The other thing I'm working on is actually with two artists working out of University of Toronto. And we're doing, more field building work in Black trans studies and trans of color studies. And so it's a project about Black trans diaspora. The hope here is to actually start to publish work that is of relevance across various geographies in various languages, and to also seed some of the art projects among Black trans folks working, for example, in Brazil, in the Mediterranean, and of course across North America. I'm also working on a public-facing Black, queer, and trans history book, and I can talk more about that, but it's really kind of, it's a part of the Beacon Press series, that people may have heard of, like there's a Black women's history of the US, there's a queer history of the US, so it's a part of that project, part of that series. And finally, I'm working on another single author manuscript on swamps. And in fact, I'm doing a Humanities Day lecture on Saturday, so there's an opportunity if you're available to hear more about that project. But it really trying to think about what the swamps tell us about the Americas, with an emphasis on thinking about the swamps as a context for racial intimacies, particularly in thinking about kind of cross-racial relations. We might think immediately of Indigenous and Black crossings in places like the swamps, but also in terms of thinking about early Asian American history, it was actually Filipinx folks who escaped Spanish colonialism by coming into New Orleans in 1763. So the story of the swamps is also a story of thinking about various kinds of racial crossings. I'll pause here, and I hope that I've left enough time. I also don't have a relationship to how much time I've spoken, but I'm really looking forward to the conversation. And so I'll take off my screen to begin to engage differently. Thanks so much for your listening, and I hope that people will, since we're in a Zoom meeting space, I hope that people will feel like they can also raise their questions directly. Thanks so much again.
Feel free to unmute yourself if you want to ask a question or type it in the chat. I don't think we have any questions in the chat yet. We were asking everyone to please identify where they work in the university since we didn't get to do intros.
Yeah, no, it's good to see who's in the room over here. Hello. I really wish that we were here in person. Truly.
I would like to hear,
Okay, go ahead, Tracy. Yeah.
I would like to hear more about the public facing book that you mentioned.
Yeah.
Black and Trans History of the United States. Is that what it is? The US or?
Yeah. So that project is most of the folks who are in the series kind of start with 1700 to the contemporary, talking about the influence and roles and presence of folks in forming what is the US. I find that certainly I'm not a person who works in the 1700s. I would suggest like mid-19th to the contemporary is more where I am interested and do most of my work. And so I've been thinking about the project organized more thematically than kind of tracing major moments in US history. So for example, the introduction is a play on Blackness by highlighting different folks whose last names are Black and who help us to think about these different moments in US history in terms of, like what is the relationship between the US and Black, queer, and trans people. So for example, I'm thinking about Phil Cora Black, who is understood to be one of the first, one of the founders of the drag scene in New York, alongside Joan Jett Black, who in the up against the first Bush ran a political campaign as a form of theater, and every time people didn't vote in the primary, she would go and claim it. If more people didn't vote than voted in the primary, she would go there and claim it as her victory, and suggest that she was moving towards the presidency with, of course, she couldn't resist, right? Who could resist the slogan "Lick Bush," right? So this was her project, and so then I'm thinking about that in relation to Marlon Riggs's film "Black Is, Black Ain't." And also with a figure, Georgia Black, who in the 1940s is credited as being a figure who integrated Sanford, Florida, when previous to the moment of her funeral, it was put on the map because it rejected Jackie Robinson from playing in their stadium. So I want to kind of think about all of these four figures as setting up some of the dynamics and the tensions of being Black, queer, and trans in the US. While also I'm interested in thinking about, like, yes, certainly we could look at a figure like Pauli Murray, who is one of the key architects for kind of developing Title IX as a way of thinking about gender protections at the level of law, who is also someone who, there's a big debate about Paulie's gender identity. So I'm interested in kind of thinking about like, how did people work in and alongside the US, but also what are all the ways that the US was an unbearable place for Black, queer, and trans people? How did they escape? How did they resist? And so that's the kind of arc of that project. And frankly, I'm not sure yet if they're gonna allow me to like not tell the story as like Black, queer people in the Revolutionary War ongoing. But it's the kind of, my desire is to tell stories across time in each chapter that help to sharpen what are some of, I think, the kind of key themes in thinking about Black, queer, and trans people in the US.
I have a question, Riley, and I'm trying to think about how to ask it. It's because basically, I think one of the interventions of Black on Both Sides is thinking about the many ways that trans identity has existed, right? And so in some ways, right, we see in the contemporary moment, we see these ideas of making identities so stable for a political representation, right? Like, this is what gay means in order to get marriage equality, right? And so your book in some ways like throws up in the air that trans identity is always about like some sort of embodiment, right? You know what I mean? And so can you talk about that? Like what does it mean to like destabilize identity in that way? And is there any pushback that you got for doing that?
Thank you so much, Tobias. What a wonderful question. What you're sharing in terms of the like talking about it in terms of like having an ethos about destabilizing our sense of identity, I think of that as the invitation of the project, right? That often, and I'll speak particularly about like, matters of trans embodiment, right? That like matters of trans embodiment is in many areas, and I'm specifically thinking here about queer studies, it's like trans folks are, I'm going to just speak shorthand and candidly here. Trans folks are often thought of as the kind of avatars of queer possibility, right? It's precisely because, the body is transformed and it's so, by being able to see that, we see what queerness can do. And, that debate has gone round and around. Part of what I was interested in doing, though, was saying, I invite you into a kind of space of relating to your identity and your embodiment with uncertainty, right? That like perhaps there are ways that we can all sit inside of a subject position where the kind of understanding of oneself and the way that the world sees us is never taken for granted. And in that space, like, like something like, and this is, I'm thinking also with a question that Beth raised with me earlier. Good to see you, Beth. That like in that space, like maybe other forms of political solidarity could be possible, right? So rather than saying we're gay and we want this thing, or we're trans, and obviously we're living also in a moment where there's incredible legislation criminalizing trans people at every stage in their development, right, across the country right now. And my view on that is, let's decriminalize and see if we can get rid of these forms of state legislation. But on the other hand, I'm also like, I am hesitant. I am worried by a kind of project that puts forward a kind of protocol for the state to tell trans people how to live their lives well. And certainly I think the kind of gay marriage one is another one where we could kind of talk about that as it is both an invitation and it's also a kind of set of confining structures, right? And so this is, in many ways, like Black on Both Sides is engaging in that kind of political praxis or that political invitation, while also kind of responding to a whole host of things about like people thinking transness is new or transness is a specific thing. And that's been something that's also like I've tried to navigate and negotiate in other like shorter form pieces as well. That's like transness isn't always about being medicalized, and you know, kind of other kind of inflections on that question. Thank you so much. I hope that kind of gets at what you're saying.
Thank you.
I have a question as well, and I apologize, I am a voice only today.
No problem.
My name is Zachary Marcus. I'm a new member of staff in student wellness.
Great.
I wonder if I can pull you to a sort of hyper contemporary question of Dave Chappelle and this current moment. And I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts. Generally, I'm particularly engaged with, troubled by this entrance of the term TERF, which of course includes the word feminism, into this, it's become quite mainstream. Of course, J.K. Rowling, quite famous for using that term. And I wonder, this mainstreaming of the term, it feels to me at times that people who are not really thinking about feminism or engaging with that are finding this term in this sort of blind defense of women in a broad sense way that I guess what are your thoughts about this? I guess Dave Chappelle calling himself a feminist and J.K. Rowling and using that term in such a specific way and not in a broader sense about commenting about women and women's rights.
Very, very interesting question. I've been following this case and would highlight taking a look at Raquel Willis on Twitter, who I think has been doing an amazing job of responding precisely to Dave Chappelle's, the full arc of that joke. But I also hear in your question a point that I want to highlight and agree with, which is that there should be a distinction between being a trans antagonist and being a TERF. That like the politics of being a TERF is a specific view of thinking about feminism by way as a way of I'm gonna speak, how do I want to put this? Feminism as the discourse, as the rightful discourse and politics of cisgender women, right? And who, you know, J.K. Rowling is, wait, Zachary, were you about to say?
I was just agreeing.
Yeah, so, I mean, I think, you know, like that now, TERFs are also, and you know, folks who want to learn, see more, learn more, you know, we know there's a Black Twitter, there's also a trans Twitter. So if you look up TERF on Twitter, you'll see a lot of the back and forth, right? And particularly trans feminine people, right? There are many stories of trans feminine academics and political movement folks who have been targeted by TERFs, self-identified feminists who are suggesting that, you know, using a lot of transphobic logic to tell folks to stop speaking or or targeting them. Now to Dave Chappelle, who it's so I'll just say also, like, you know, Chappelle Show, as complicated as that was as a text, one of my favorite shows. And I actually I think my first publication was a chapter about Dave Chappelle's block party, right? So I have this like, you know, like historical fandom that I've already had to like situate as being in the past, well before we got to this specific video, this specific Netflix show. But I think, yeah, I think it would have been more accurate for Chappelle to have said, I agree with my TERF friends, and I'm also a trans antagonist. Like that would have been like the more like clear, direct way of expressing his thoughts. And of course, you know, part of what's sticky about this, and I'm trying to kind of tell you a little bit without spoiling it, and as it relates to the fact that I have chosen not to watch this, that I've been choosing to like take this in through social media, through people that I trust. But you know, part of the stickiness is also that he invokes a trans woman who he calls his friend, and in fact suggests that it's because trans people are policing the borders of what it means to be trans, that she was grappling with mental health situations that eventually led to suicide. And so this is also a huge piece, right? Like, so let's get beyond the terminology to talk a little bit about how forms of popular trans antagonism is in many ways, right? Like various forms of victim blaming, ways of trying to manipulate how power works, if we were really just to look at it. And so, you know, this has been like the set of ideas that have been coming up as this continues to unfold. I also recognize that trans employees at Netflix, some have been fired, some have been quitting. So I think of this as a ongoing, unfolding story. And in terms of my, you know, as I said, I was a fan, and I've just been living with years of disappointment. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
I would love to ask a question. Um, this is coming from my experience in Riley's class, that was largely centered on care work, but I'm kind of curious about how you think about care work and praxis and the work that you have done in the past, and maybe how that has changed or how you're trying to apply that in the future works that you're working on.
Yeah, thanks so much, Beth. I think care is it's a political praxis that shows up in how one tells the stories that they're telling, especially, you know, in the register of scholarship. You know, one of the other things that's super critical for me, and I was trained by an ethnographer, and so you know, there are lots of ways that I find grounding myself in political work in relation to the communities that I write about as part of, even if it doesn't show up in any way in the text, as part of what it means to be ethically related. You know, I often think, like, you know, it's at least a useful exercise to replace conversations about method with conversations about ethics. And I was like, where do we end up if we end up substituting those words in terms of how we approach an idea, a question, and how to potentially answer that question, or how do we get to a better question, right? And so I think the last part I'll say is that, like, how do you know, right? Like, how do you know that what you thought of as care is present, is palpable? And that has to do with like being willing to and hearing the reception in that very register. Like, one of the things, and Tobias, I realized I didn't answer the part about, like, is there pushback? Not to me. I mean, nobody tells me like that they don't like, you know, like the invitation, right? That but I do also think some of the pushback is perhaps the desire to reduce the project to, oh, this is like Black trans history, which it is that, but it's also about a lot of other things. And I think in terms of how I understand Black on Both Sides as a project of care, it has been very meaningful, even as I've explicitly decided no longer to work in the contemporary, to be doing historiographic projects. There are figures who, people who have known these people have reached out to me. And certainly when you get notes from people's friends and, loved ones, before reading them, you could be full of terror, like, oh my gosh, like, what are they going to tell me about this? But one of the most meaningful moments was like a person, telling me, and this is in the preface, that this figure, Blake Brockington, was their good friend, and they were worried that they would only be understood through, media representations and their Wikipedia account, which continues to be described as the death of Blake Brockington rather than by his name, Blake Brockington. And so that is like a small moment of understanding that there is care that's present. I think with other projects, I'm also moving collaboratively, and that to me is also about what does it mean to think differently about the conditions for producing knowledge, right? That like the idea that one person's book is on the spine of any book, I think is a myth, right? That there's so many folks that contribute to these projects, and I feel really fortunate to be able to work in collaboration with people in more explicit ways at this point. So yeah, those are just like a few different ways that I would suggest that, but I love the question. And obviously I loved that we had our kind of first meetings in the classroom.
Thank you.
I have another question too that I think relates to that, and it's a little bit selfish because it's about my own work. And I told you a little bit, Riley, about the fact that I was writing about the prancing elites, and I'm defending soon. And so what's interesting is that I also use Eve Sedgwick's reparative reading, right, as a way to approach these texts, right? Because I wasn't interested in like, being suspicious or being paranoid about, these cultural products. And in particular, because I didn't want to tell Black people you are being duped by the prancing elites or by empire or by pose, right? And there are these things you don't see that make it bad, right? I was interested in thinking about how these television shows give us, different answers to like socio-political questions that often circulate in cultural studies and stuff like that. So I want to know, because I think it connects to this idea of care work, right? This reparative reading, right? Are we too suspicious, right? When we like go toward these cultural products, right? Do we need to have another way of thinking about reading things that Black people enjoy, right?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Rather than like always ripping apart or saying, there's value in that, right? Because it teaches us. But so much of what we do is we want to tell you why something's wrong, right? We want to tell you what you don't see. And so how do we, and should we be doing another kind of scholarship in this moment, when democracy's falling, right? When everything around us is collapsing? How do we do research? How do we ask questions?
Yeah, that's such a like exciting question. I have also been thinking about like how it is that we're enduring multiple pandemics at once, right? And there are so many sets of feelings, right? Like, and people are holding a lot of grief, people are holding all kinds of things. And I've been, thinking a lot about like the kind of, often people will ask, and this is, I promise I will get to addressing this question directly, but often people will ask like, well, how do you keep your joy? And I was like, I feel like that question, I'm always like, I don't know how to even answer. What do you mean? Why do you presume that I have some? But in many ways, like I try to, respond by saying the building block to joy is a practice of gratitude. And so I try to be in a practice of gratitude, and hopefully something like joy might be on the horizon. And in many ways, I am also deeply interested in like pleasure, right? And obviously there are politics to pleasure. It's not divorced from the political field or zone, but it's also pleasure, you know, and like more pleasure, not less, right? So in some ways I hear you and agree, right? That like the project of dealing with popular materials media studies is not to say you shouldn't enjoy that, but rather that you know, to sit with what is making this enjoyable. And I think that that becomes more a project of curiosity than it is a project of you know, like and this is what's wrong with us because we like such and such a thing, right? A project of pathology. And in many ways, you know, I think in some ways, right, like Stuart Hall has said this in different ways. Certainly this is like a kind of key turn in queer of color critique, right? That is also taking up Sedgwick. But I also I like to remain curious about what suspicion gives us to. And I'm interested in, you know, I think of paranoia as a kind of knowledge, right? So I'm not gonna dismiss either one of them. But what I will say is like, let's just be curious about it. Let's be uncertain. Maybe we don't know as scholars, as viewers, all of the things that attend the emotions that come up with our kind of being in the world and what we engage or consume.
Awesome note to end on. Let's be curious. Thank you, Riley, so much for going first, for setting a tone, for sharing all that you've shared with us. Thank everybody for coming. And I want to just remind you that we have 2 more coming up this quarter. On November 10th, November 10th will be Kathy Cohen from the Department of Political Science. And then on December 8th, Honey Crawford from Theater and Performance Studies. So we hope you'll come back again. Please take a minute to fill out our survey, join our listserv, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks so much, everyone. And I look forward to being in touch with you in all kinds of ways. Let's stay in touch on Twitter or Instagram, or you can use the university email. All right, more soon. Here.
Bye.